Welcome back, everyone, to Day 5 of EEI's 5th Annual Global Electrification Forum, or GEF. If you are just joining us today, my name is Vanessa Ferrero, and I'm a manager for international programs at EEI. I'll be your MC throughout the GEF. Today's sessions are all about the digital transformation. We're excited to be starting off Day 5 with an opening session on sustaining transformational change with Greg Satell, author of Cascades and Mapping Innovation. Greg will be joined in conversation by EEI Vice President for International Programs, Dr. Lawrence Jones. Without further ado, please welcome Lawrence and Greg to the stage.
Good morning. Hi, Greg. How are you doing?
Lawrence, how are you?
I'm doing great. Well, welcome to this fifth day of the Global Electrification Forum. We're glad to have you as our opening guest for this conversation. And I'd like to jump straight into it because we have 30 minutes and I want us to cover as much as possible. So Vanessa introduced you and talked about Cascades and your other book, which I think is also very interesting, the Mapping Innovation. So to kick things off, tell us, how do you get from Mapping Innovation to Cascades?
So Mapping Innovation I wrote because I had a particular problem. I spent most of my adult life leading organizations, and like many other leaders, I always felt an incredible pressure to innovate, but I wasn't quite sure how to go about it. So that's what led me on the path to mapping innovation. And one of the things I found in my research, talking to innovators of all stripes, world-class scientists, researchers, incredibly successful entrepreneurs, top executives at multinational firms, that everybody kind of has their own piece of it, and that innovation is never a single event. We like to boil things down to that apple hitting Newton in the head, or that moment of epiphany. But in reality, innovation is never a single event. It's always a process of discovery, engineering, and then transformation. So in the case of electricity, the main principles were discovered by Faraday in the 1820s and 30s. So that was the discovery phase. Edison sort of inaugurated the engineering phase, and then that transformation took quite a long time. I mean, Edison had the first electric light and his first electric plant in Pearl Street in New York was 1882, I believe. And then we didn't actually see an economic impact until 1920. So almost 40 years for that transformation phase. So that transformation phase is much more complicated and much more difficult than people give it credit for. And one of the things I noticed is, even with something as important and good as electricity and as world changing as it was, there was deep-seated resistance to it in many, many different circles. Some great research on even just the one aspect of electrifying factories and how long that took. So that's what really Cascades is about that second question. How can we drive transformation and make these incredible possibilities a reality in the face of inevitable resistance? How can we do that? And that's what I sought to learn in Cascades. And as you know, I found some very interesting and unexpected things.
Well, look, we'll get into some of the interesting things. So for the audience, can you, in a few words, summarize what is a cascade? Because you kind of talk about that in the book, but what is it? How do you describe?
Cascade's a natural process. It's a long chain of viral activity. So think about, for instance, a wave at a stadium, or people lining up outside an Apple store or out of a hit movie. What we see when we see these long, movements like the Orange Revolution I was in, or or even technology transformation and transformation within an organization, we always see this kind of networked activity at work. And the shorthand I give for it in the book was small groups, loosely connected, but uh, guided by a shared purpose.
Mhm.
Uh, is what drives transformational change and cascades.
So you use the word viral activity, and I'm always curious about. I wonder, how was viral activities occurring pre-digitalization, pre-internet? Can you talk a little bit about that? How did cascades occur prior to the internet and prior to digitalization?
Uh, that's a great question because they happened, right? I mean, and I should mention here one of my uh, primary focuses of my Cascades research was social and political movements, which I found there was a great advantage because the documentation is so good,
Mhm.
right? I mean, we know much more about uh, historical events like the women's suffrage or civil rights or anti-apartheid than we know about, case studies within an organization, which usually happen when a business school professor or consultant, interviews half a dozen people and writes to the best of their ability uh, what they think actually happened. But when you go back to, women's suffrage or the Indian independence, it happens quite the same way. It, it the velocity changes. I remember in the Orange Revolution, which I played a small role in. We we didn't have smartphones, and we didn't have, there wasn't YouTube yet or anything like that, but we did have internet bulletin boards and texts. um, Before that, in the Soviet Union, they used fax machines. Before there were fax machines, they had samizdat, which was sort of a portmanteau of sam izdatel, so self-published things. So, um, and then of course in the civil rights movement, and they had other ways of doing it. Around churches was one of the primary ones. um, but people always find a way. But I think those three elements uh, are, are always there, that you have these small groups that are loosely connected to other like-minded groups who can bring in others, who can bring in others still, and then united by this shared purpose. And I think in terms of leadership, sometimes leaders think that their role is to plan and direct action. And I think especially today, when we increasingly live in a networked world, the role of a leader is to give that shared purpose and to facilitate those connections and empower uh, people to drive transformation.
Quickly, before we get into the specifics of this conference, which is around the energy transformation and looking towards the year 2050, is you talk about leadership and you give a couple examples where I know you reference General Stanley McChrystal and
Hmm.
his time in Afghanistan and his time in Army. Can you talk about that experience of having his example in the book? Why him, and what was so fascinating about the whole Army approach to leadership that you've taught to include in the book?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I included him for a couple of reasons. One reason is again just the documentation, right? He wrote a book, and his chief of staff wrote a book, a man named Chris Fussell, and I was able to have extensive conversations with Chris about what happened. The other Another reason was when I was looking for examples, and people continually brought up Stanley McChrystal in this incredible transformation he made in in the special forces and in Iraq. And if you remember, in the introduction, I have these kind of, and I always think it's very, very important to look at both successes and failures. So if you remember, in the introduction, in the beginning of the book, I give these sort of six or let's say three pairs of examples. So there was Occupy movement, which I'm sure everybody has heard of, the Otpor movement, and which was obviously a failure, the Otpor movement in Serbia, which was a success, and then Blockbuster and Stanley McChrystal, and then Silicon Valley and the Boston technology. So it sort of fit within that, and I thought that the contrast between what Stanley McChrystal did and what Blockbuster did was, I thought, was very stark. And without going into details about the Blockbuster story, but the leader there was somebody who was incredibly smart, incredibly successful, but in my view, missed the importance of networks, meaning he had the right strategy, he had the right execution, but failed to align stakeholder networks behind it. And without going into depth about that story, where General McChrystal did exactly the opposite, came to exactly the opposite conclusion. And he said, listen, as a leader, I can come up with the right strategy and the right execution, but if they're waiting for me, that strategy and execution is going to be wrong by the time it hits the ground. And if I want to defeat a network, I'm going to have to become a network, not because we're going to act like hierarchies don't exist. And this is actually very, very important. They never changed the command structure. The same command structure was in place.
Mhm.
So the issue wasn't authority or hierarchy. The issue, it wasn't that the hierarchy had somehow become illegitimate. It was just the hierarchy was too slow and the world had become fast. And that's why he needed to focus on networks. So I
So
thought it was a really interesting case study.
yeah, well, I think it's very interesting that you laid it out that way. So let's come and talk about the energy industry. The theme of this conference, Destination 2050, and the premise we laid out here is we are going through a period where we're going to have some inflection. There will be pathways to cross. There will be crossroads, and then ultimately you will have convergence. And I'm sure you've been following what's happened in the industry with regards to climate change, with regards to the goal to get to net zero, and all these different movements that are occurring around the energy industry. How do you put this in the context of Cascade? What are we missing as we think of the transformation of the energy system? What do we need to think about for success in this movement that we now
Well,
have around us?
I wouldn't presume to say that you're missing anything, because there's a lot of smart people in the energy industry, and I'm sure there's a lot of different people that have different parts of the answer. I would say two things, two insights I can offer that might be helpful. The first is we tend to look at inventions, but inventions don't get us very far. It's ecosystems that get us very far. That's the difference between electricity and the invention of the electric light bulb and the first electric generator plant at Pearl Street, and electricity in 1920, when it actually became an important economic entity. And you saw the development of lots of secondary and tertiary inventions. If you look at, for instance, synthetic biology today, uh, there's a whole ecosystem, not just pharmaceutical companies, but companies that are selling nucleotides. And so I think you have to take this more biological approach than a typical I don't think the solutions in the energy sector are going to be engineered. I think they're going to be empowered and grown and pruned, um, and things kind of take a life of themselves, and you can help shape that, um, but you can't just turn it on or off. So I think always taking that ecosystem view, and also that ecosystems are in my view are essentially networks of networks. And that's helpful because, as you know, we know a lot about networks. We know that in networks, power doesn't go from the top down, it emanates from the center out, and that you move to the center by connecting to the edge. So knowing those things, we can help shape those things much better. The second thing I would say that might be helpful is that every transformation, if it's an important one, and if it has the potential to impact people, there's always going to be people who don't like this idea, no matter how great the potential. And there's always going to be some people who work to undermine it in ways that are dishonest and underhanded and deceptive. And that always has to be a primary design constraint, because you are going to need to overcome that resistance in order to bring a true transformation about.
So one of the things that I find fascinating about the idea of this transformation, we've called this session sustaining transformational change, right? So how do you sustain it over the long haul once you've started the change that's coming to place? And in the book, you talk about two things. One, about the diffusion of innovation, which I think is very interesting in the context of Cascades. But then when I come back to the hierarchical structures you talk about and the ecosystem, the energy system has around it a lot of stakeholders, one of which happens to be regulators and policymakers, right? So invention can occur, but how does one then deal with the regulatory and policy and some of the exogenous factors that affect the transformation? What should we think about in the context of Cascades to navigate all of those sort of external factors that could shape the transformation?
So this is something we deal with all the time in our workshops. And there's certain tools that we use, and these tools have been around for decades, uh, in in but primarily used in political revolutions. What we find is they work just as well in a uh, organizational or industrial or institutional environment. One tool is called the Spectrum of Allies, which focuses on different types of people who might be uh, enthusiastic about this change, or neutral, or highly opposed, but mapping out where those people are. And that's called the Spectrum of Allies. The other tool is called the Pillar of Support, and that focuses on institutions, because very much like you described, we need institutions to affect change. And some of those institutions are in the government. You need legislatures, you need local governments, you need city halls, you need regulators. These are all very, very important institutions. They're not the only institutions, but they're important ones. So the important thing to and I'm sort of boiling down something that we spend a lot of time on with the organizations we work with. So I'm sorry if this comes off a little bit maybe oversimplified, but you really need to map out the wide what those institutions are. So the the legislatures, for instance, they're not an entity unto themselves. They are affected by other institutions, whether that is the media, whether that is corporations, whether that is um, industrial uh, associations. So all different associations. But then when you're planning your tactics, when you're looking at actions, you're always mobilizing people to influence institutions. And you're always mobilizing somebody to influence something, and those are the two questions you always have to ask. Who are we mobilizing to influence what? You can't. So, and I think education is a great thing to look at, because we're all involved in education somehow. We all went to school. A lot of us have kids, so we're somewhat familiar. So, um, and this is the issue I have with stakeholder mapping. Obviously, parents are a stakeholder in education, and school boards are a stakeholder in education. So, but they're very different stakeholders. You mobilize parents to influence school boards, not the other way around. And there's no point in just going and getting parents riled up unless you actually have a plan to influence the school board. And what education activists have found, there's no point in just doing things directly with the school board, because if you don't get support among the constituencies, you're going to have, for political groups, rally people to show up at school board meetings and reverse those changes that you thought were always in the key. Now, the energy sector, of course, is far more complex than that, but I think that basic principle will serve you well. Understand your constituencies, understand the institutions that have the power to affect change, and mobilize those constituencies to influence those institutions. So I hope that's clear. It's a bit boiled down.
No, it helped, and we have about we may run a few minutes over here, but I want to move now from this sort of the macro level, sort of the institutional approach, and maybe get down to sort of the CEO approach, right? So a lot of CEOs who are attending this conference and other executives are going to be faced with tremendous decisions to be made regarding long-term investments. And one of the things I'd like to get your view on is how does one, from an innovation perspective, how does one diffuse innovative ideas, not necessarily technology, innovative ideas across the industry to somehow sustain this transformation that is afoot? What are your thoughts on that?
So this is funny. I'm going to steal some thoughts from somebody else. I have a friend, some of you might have heard of him. His name is Alex Osterwalder, and he invented something called the business model canvas, which is an important component of the lean startup. And he's built this incredible method for experiments. So to whatever extent possible, you don't want to be making those big investments. You want to be making small investments, see what it succeeds. And he recommends making 250 smaller investments, and you kill half of them in 3 months. And I'm not sure whether that's the right numbers, but nothing sells like success.
Mhm.
And we tell with the organizations we work with as well, what we see is that all too often when you have a big transformation, people want to start it big. And that's more than often, that is more often than not, I would say actually the vast majority of the time, that is a mistake. Start with a small group who's already enthusiastic about this change and empower them to be successful. If you can't make them successful, you should question whether this is a change you should make. But if they are successful, then you can build on that success and grow it into that massive investment that can have an impact. But you don't want to start with that, right? You want to start with a number of ideas that that you can, and you want to shrink failure down to the point where it won't kill you, right? It'll just be sort of a blip until you move to the other thing. And I'll make one more point on this subject, but don't be shy about killing projects, right? Keep them small, so that they can be killed, and then as one succeeds, let it grow and empower it.
So got about 10 minutes left here, or less. But so I want to move back macro. So going from macro back to micro. Let's go macro here for a second. So next week, President Biden is going to be hosting the climate summit, if you may, with about 40 world leaders. And you talk about the cascade, and you talk about impacting different stakeholder groups to make things move forward. We had a very critical moment for the world with regards to climate change. Everyone has talked about it. So if you were sitting in a room, in that room with 40 world leaders and President Biden, what would you tell them in the context of saying, ladies and gentlemen, we're at this moment and there's a movement afoot with regards to doing something about climate change? What advice would you give them in terms of how they craft policies that will be there for the long haul? What would you tell them?
So what I would say is, I think we've gotten obsessed with this word compromise. And then some people say we shouldn't compromise. And then other people say that compromise shouldn't be a bad word. I don't think compromise should even be in our vocabulary. Compromise, implies that you start over here and I start over there, and we come up with a solution that neither of us can be happy with, and then we each get sort of half of what we want. And I don't think that's a good policy, and I don't think in terms of energy, I don't think it's viable. We can't have a half solution to zero carbon. What I think is a much more effective approach is starting from the middle out. So starting what we already agree on. And we've developed a technique that is so incredibly effective, it's almost like a Jedi mind trick. So remember, I was telling you, whatever the change is, there's going to be people who hate it, who want to undermine it in ways that are dishonest and underhanded and deceptive. And you shouldn't engage with those people because that's unlikely to be an honest engagement. But you can listen to them, right? So this is sort of the trick. You have to master the art of not engaging, but listening. Because one, they can point out flaws in your idea that you might not see. But two, and possibly even more importantly, they will clue you in to shared values. If you can reimagine that objection as a shared value. And just to give a very simple example, and I understand that this example is not sufficient, but talk to anybody who is very skeptical about climate change. They always mention the economy. Well, that's a shared value. Economic prosperity is a shared value. And we can talk about prosperity, and we can talk about successes we've already have, like the investment the U.S. government made in Tesla back in 2009. So that's still not going to, that's probably not going to convince the real skeptics, the people who hate this idea almost irrationally, but it is most likely going to be an effective strategy for those sort of people in the middle who are, who are neutral or maybe a little bit skeptical, because listening to our most ardent opponents will clue us in to what they believe is effective with those people in the middle. So that's what I would say. Don't think in terms of compromise. Think in terms of finding that shared common ground and building out from there, rather than starting at both extremes and working towards the center.
Well, I would hope that they're listening, because if you think of what COVID-19 has taught us, is that we need to listen to one another to find shared value. I think the shared value from the COVID experience, or the COVID pandemic, is we want to survive, we want to live. And I think from the standpoint of climate change, the shared value there is that we want a prosperous planet that we all can live on. So I think that's going to be key. Well, got two more questions, Greg, and we're going to have to wrap it up.
These are great questions, by the way. Thank you for them.
Well, when you have the opportunity to interview Greg Satell, you better make sure you do your homework, right? But just two quick questions to wrap up here. The first one, Greg, is you talked about networks, and you and I understand networks. We've looked at it from a scientific standpoint, engineering standpoint. So how do I explain network to my 10-year-old daughter? How do we get average people, if you may, or people not average, but how do you get people to understand the complexity of networks so that they can apply it in their day-to-day living?
That is a great question. I should ask my 11-year-old daughter about it.
Well, mine is 10, so we can share ideas. We can share answers from both our daughters.
Well, what I would say is we tend to understand the world in terms of nodes. So, uh, so my little girl, she has lots of friends at school, and there's a lot of drama between these friends with a 10-year-old girl. I'm sure you can understand.
Sure.
And what I would say is, if you look just at the girls and boys, you're missing something, because it's the dynamics of the connections between those boys and girls that drives what happens at the school. So it's not uh, it's not the nodes, it's the links that drive events.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be important as we go next week at the Global Electrification Forum. We're having a panel session on intergenerational views on climate change, and it's interesting as I've looked at the Generation Z. When they're ruling the world, they will have a whole different perspective on half of the things we're talking about. So I think understanding the networks or the linkages between the nodes across generation, I think, is also very important. Well, Greg, last question, and this one is an easy one. I hope it is. So you've done mapping innovation, you've had Cascades, and I've seen a lot of your writings on LinkedIn, and I've read some of the other work. So tell us what's next. What's the next book? What's the next idea we're going to be reading from Greg Satell?
So I have a very, very disappointing answer for you. I am so inspired by the work I'm doing with Cascades. This is what I want to do for the next bit of time, because the organizations we work with who are trying to transform and are having such trouble because they run into this resistance, and helping them to navigate and overcome that resistance is just so gratifying. I have to say, it's the most inspiring work I've ever done.
Well, listen, you're trying to transform corporations. We're in the midst of a transformation of an entire industry, and soon perhaps the entire world. So I think Cascades has many applications beyond corporations. It can be applied all throughout the whole overall economy. So, Greg, it's really a pleasure. Hope we can meet in person once the pandemic is over. And we really enjoyed you coming to EEI and spending some time with us at the Global Electrification Forum. Good luck on the books and good luck on the projects.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lawrence, anytime you're in Philadelphia, the best cheesesteak in town is on me.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Greg and Lawrence, for a thought-provoking conversation. You gave us a lot to consider as the energy industry and the world at large undergoes a monumental transition as we head to 2050. If you'd like to spark your own transformations, we invite you to check out Greg's latest book, Cascades: How to Create a Movement That Drives Transformational Change. You can find his book and those of other authors who are speaking at the Jeff by visiting our Destination 2050 bookstore in the Expo area.